this coming crisis in insurability of homes in the United States, that is about to make climate change very real for almost everybody, because it's going to touch, if you have a homeowner's insurance premium, it's going to affect it. So like that's already playing out right now. And so in a sense, we don't need to time travel, to mid-century or the end of the century. Although if you do that, and again, if you talk to climate scientists, they will paint some pretty grim picture for you of what it's like to live in a world that is 3 degrees warmer. And that's what we're on track for right now. I don't know if it's really widely understood just how bad that is. Like you don't want to live in that world. That's a world in which we have hundreds of millions of people migrating because it's too hot where they live. They don't have enough water where they live.
Welcome to Deep Dive with me, Sean C. Fedek. Climate change isn't a distant threat. It's here, now, reshaping our world in ways that scientists have long warned about. From record-breaking heat waves to devastating wildfires, rising sea levels to extreme weather events, we are experiencing the consequences of decades of inaction. And yet, despite the overwhelming scientific consensus and clear warnings from experts, meaningful climate policy remains a political battleground rather than a global priority. What happens if policymakers continue to ignore the crisis? What are the long-term consequences if political leaders refuse to act? And that begs the question, what does a second Trump presidency mean for climate action in the United States, and frankly, the rest of the world? With Trump picking up where he left off from his first term, which was marked by environmental deregulation, withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, and an embrace of fossil fuels, the stakes for our planet in 2024 could not be higher. In today's episode, I'm joined by Jonathan Mingle, journalist and author of Fire and Ice, who has written extensively about climate change, pollution, and the human cost of inaction. We discuss the science, the policies, the real potential consequences of this second Trump presidency, and the urgent choices that we need to make now that will determine the future of the planet. All right, if you like this episode or any episode, please give it a like, share, and follow on your favorite podcast platform, and or subscribe to the podcast on YouTube. And as always, if you have any thoughts, questions, or comments, please feel free to email me at deepdivewithsean@gmail.com. Let's do a deep dive. Jonathan, thanks for being here. How are you?
I'm doing well, Sean. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really glad to have you here because I think that one of the real threats to, well, I guess our future, our democracy, our way of life, et cetera, is climate change. And when we talk about climate change, I think the average person, myself included, if they believe in it and if they care, I suppose, conceptualize it as something that, might require some adjustment to our daily lives, how we live, some changes we might have to make, the cost of things like insurance, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
But it's actually a bigger threat than that. It's more serious than that. The impacts of climate change will dramatically impact probably every aspect of our lives, and it will lead to mass migration, some of which we may be feeling in the United States right now, as climate change leads to things like droughts and floods and inhospitable land for farming, et cetera. People are leaving for more stable areas.
Mm-hmm.
So policy then is incredibly important. It both impacts how we address these issues, but is also impacted by the consequence of climate change. And some of the policy coming out of the White House now, especially related to immigration, could very well be directly linked to climate change, even if we don't understand that or even know that that's the underlying factor. So this is something you research and you write about quite extensively. So I appreciate you being here to discuss this.
I'm happy to do it. And you're right. I mean, it's a subject that I think for a lot of people just feels overwhelming. And, for a long time, it's felt abstract, I think, for a lot of people who just kind of casually keep up with the news and try to figure out how it fits into their lives. And even for someone like me, I'm a reporter who focuses on climate change and energy politics. even for me, it can feel a little too big to wrap my arms around on any given day. So you're absolutely right about that. And in this moment, in particular, we're undergoing some rapid policy shifts in the last couple of weeks. So that makes it even harder to orient yourself.
Yeah, and I don't want to oversimplify it, but I think in a lot of areas, but climate change, germane to the conversation that we're having specifically, it feels like we're on the precipice of make it or break it. And it feels like the last 2 weeks has pretty much almost ensured that we're going to break it. And like I said, in a lot of ways, and I don't want to sound histrionic, but it does sound like we are at that moment in history where something dramatic has to be done. And that requires thoughtful leadership. And I feel like we missed the boat on that one. And how do you feel about that?
Well, I think it's fair to say that with the new administration that's taken charge, we're going to see a wholesale retreat of the federal government from climate action, right? I think we should all just assume we're not going to see the federal government really do anything with the words climate change in it. In fact, they're scrubbing those words from the websites of federal agencies as we speak. So thinking about this stuff at this moment, early February 2025, it kind of requires us to get comfortable with some cognitive dissonance because, the big picture on climate at the moment is, on the one hand, clean energy, solar, wind, electric vehicles, batteries, have never been cheaper. They've never been deployed faster or more widely. If you just look at that side of the coin, there's a lot of progress being made to wean our economies off of fossil fuels, which, burning fossil fuels, that's the primary driver of climate change. But at the same time, in terms of the actual climate itself, things are warming up and destabilizing faster than even the experts expected. If you talked to them a few years ago, we hit over 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels last year. 2024 was the warmest year ever recorded, beating 2023, which held the previous record. I just saw a report today that January 2025 was the warmest January ever on record at 1.75 degrees above the pre-industrial average. So, the trends in terms of the climate, not looking good, right?
Yeah.
But, you can look for glimmers of hope in terms of policy market shifts towards renewable energy in certain parts of the world. And so what is the average person who's not steeped in this stuff every day left to conclude, especially, in the wake of the change in power in Washington, D.C., it's all a little disorienting when you add it up. And that is what we're called upon to do, though. You're called to reconcile these truths that are in tension, right? Which is that there is real momentum behind the clean energy transition, and yet we're not doing nearly enough, and we're not doing it fast enough to keep pace with, the changes in the climate itself and to meet the targets that have been agreed upon by governments and industry actors. You look around, we're in a moment where there's kind of generalized retreat by major institutions from climate action, whether it's corporations or now the US federal government.
So there are some good actors on the world stage, or better actors, let's say, on the world stage, that at least for now, at the nation state level, acknowledge that climate change is a real thing, are taking steps to meet some targets, are investing in that. And as we both have said, the new administration suggests that we might be in the United States taking it a completely different direction. And so, like, brass tacks, let's say the rest of the world, or at least the part of the world that is the highest polluting, if they were to take this seriously and the United States were to completely reverse and not only dismantle any climate change initiatives, but also contribute to climate change in a much more escalated way, is it possible that the United States alone could be the demise of, well, Earth?
Well, I mean, the US accounts for something like, I want to say 13% of global greenhouse gas emissions.
Mm-hmm.
So we're the second biggest polluter after China.
China,
But
yeah.
historically, we are the biggest, right? We have contributed the most to anthropogenic climate change over the past couple centuries. And so, that means we have a certain moral responsibility, especially to parts of the world that are still pulling people out of poverty, like in India, Indonesia. These are fast growing economies. They are trying to bring electricity access to millions of people still, right? And the argument you hear from their governments is, why should we have to, balance the climate ledger on our backs if you're not pulling your own weight, United States? So there's a risk in terms of global climate diplomacy and governance. We just withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement. That now you could say, well, it doesn't make a big difference because it's a voluntary agreement and there are no enforcement mechanisms, and there are a lot of other countries that aren't following through on their pledges, to the climate treaty framework anyway. So what difference does that make? And it's hard to quantify, but to answer your question, I think there are serious risks that the U.S. withdrawing from that arena, both, in nuts and bolts terms, but also symbolic terms, is very damaging, right? There's a risk that it takes wind out of the sails of these other big countries, and I'm thinking of like India, Brazil, takes wind out of sails of their climate pledges and their own ambition, right, to transition their economies away from fossil fuels, to tackle deforestation. In India, they burn a lot of coal, and they have state subsidized coal companies. This is all stuff that it's going to be a heavy lift. And if the U.S. isn't there to be a leader symbolically, but also, finance, like climate finance from north to the global south, if we're retreating from those obligations, and if we're retreating, in terms of doing our own work to decarbonize our economy, yeah, I think it's very damaging. It destroys trust, and trust is the fuel on which that whole framework was supposed to operate, right? Like Paris was designed to be this race to the top, peer pressure driven ratcheting of climate ambition system. And now there's a risk that it ratchets in the other direction.
So it strikes me that one of the things that we really struggle with is just understanding what climate change is. And one of the narratives that you hear increasingly, at least in contemporary times, from climate change deniers, well, there's a handful of things you hear. One is beyond logic to me, which is that, well, this is all biblical anyway. And there's just no logically debating that. But the others are that, well, this is cyclical, that the
climate's always changing.
Yeah, the climate is always changing. And also there's snow on my front yard, so like, what are we talking about here? It's not warm. So I guess I'm wondering, can you bumper sticker, maybe as best you can, what climate change is and then what the biggest threats are?
Yeah, I've never been good at writing bumper stickers, but basically what's going on is we're dumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere faster than natural sinks can absorb them. And that traps more heat, which causes rising temperatures, which destabilizes the global climate system, ocean currents, monsoons, melts ice caps. That drives up sea level, and on and on and on. We could go on cataloging all the impacts, but basically humanity has had a nearly 3-century long habit of burning coal, oil, and gas, and we can't kick it. And when you burn that stuff, it dumps carbon into the atmosphere, and that just is trapping too much heat and causing all kinds of chaos. And so, basically the project is weaning ourselves off of our longstanding reliance on these fossil fuels as fast as we can. And, that is an unprecedented project in human history, right? So it should be bumpy and challenging and politically fraught. But when you talk to climate scientists, which I do as a journalist, they are getting pretty worried, right? Like the changes are happening faster and harder than many of them expected. The rate of warmings, seems to be increasing, and they're trying to explain it. And there's a risk that there are these feedback mechanisms. You can think of permafrost in the Arctic thawing and coughing CO2 and methane in vast quantities of the atmosphere as an example, or wetlands are expanding, and more wetlands means more methane. When those things kick in, they take on a momentum of their own that we can't control. So there is a sense that we may be on the cusp of some, to use a phrase scientists are fond of, nonlinear changes, right? Like step changes that make, think of a runaway train, make the project even harder. Right. If the goal is to keep a stable climate, a climate that is familiar to us or recognizable to us, one that encouraged human civilization to develop, then, we have to basically remake our energy system, but also tackle things like the way we grow food, and we got to stop cutting down the tropical forests and boreal forests. It's a massive undertaking, right? Mm-hmm. But if there is a bumper sticker for me as someone who reports on this, like energy is driving most of this problem, right? Like, so burning fossil fuels for transportation, make electricity, industrial uses to heat buildings, that's like 3/4 of the problem, right? And the rest is deforestation, agriculture, land use. But if you want to boil it down, burning coal, oil, and gas is the reason we're boiling the atmosphere.
I think there are a lot of apocalyptic scenarios as to what, the world looks like if climate change wins, right? But I don't know that it's clear to me or to my neighbors or to the average person what life looks like if we continue down this path in 10, 20, 30 years. So like, what are some things that you would expect? And you've already touched on some of this, but I think a lot of people kind of dismiss it out of hand as being something that's not going to impact them.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, right? Because you have people in, I live in Seattle, people in Seattle saying some of the stuff that's happening in hurricanes, increased intensity of hurricanes, that's not going to happen to me, right? And then you have people in Florida that's like, well, we don't really have to worry too much about things like tornadoes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is untrue, actually. So I think there's this weird kind of relationship where everybody's feeling something, but they're looking at everyone else and saying, well, that's not going to happen here, right? So I guess I'm wondering, what could we just generally expect to be happening over the next couple of decades?
Before I tackle that, I mean, we can just look at what's happening now or in the last couple of years, arriving ahead of schedule, right? Whether you're talking about the wildfires that just hit LA, or Hurricane Helene in northwestern North Carolina, or even here in Vermont, where I live, we had terrible floods in the summer of 2023, 2024. And when you read, news coverage of these events or talk to people who experience them, you often hear this pattern. People say, oh, this is surreal. I didn't, they're grappling with the surreality of it, right? And we're all used to reading about disasters and extreme weather events happening to other people. Increasingly, they're happening to me too, and you too, and your neighbor too. And so some of the examples, you mentioned some of them. Why should you be worried about how climate change is going to affect you or your family? It kind of looks like something different depending where you live. Maybe out west, you're worried about wildfires, where, California, like fire season used to be a few months of the year. Now it's almost year round, right? Maybe you live in coastal North Carolina, you go to parts of the Outer Banks and you can watch houses collapsing into the sea every week. In places like Rodanthe, North Carolina, sea level rise, a normal storm surge is just clawing these houses into the ocean. But even less dramatic examples than that, if you go to Norfolk, Virginia, or Miami, on a sunny day, they have flooding just because, sea level's creeping up and it pushes ocean water through their storm drains and floods busy intersections. Heat waves, right? Like Phoenix, 2 summers ago, I think they had 40 days in a row over 110 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the kind of impact that you extrapolate that out a few decades. I saw a study the other day in Europe later this century, they're projecting like 2 to 3 million deaths from heat waves. There are parts of North Africa and South Asia. If we keep on the track we're going, it'll be too hot to work outside for much of the year, right? And so these things can seem abstract or distant in time and space, but I think what we're seeing is, let's just keep it here in the US. You're seeing these impacts kind of hit home in lots of different corners of the country in ways that people aren't prepared for. And like another example is I live in New England, in a city like Boston, historically you didn't need air conditioning, right, in your school. And there are all these schools that were built, in the 60s. Well, increasingly they have these heat waves, and without air conditioning, kids get dizzy, nauseous. They have to go home. They have to close school for the day, right? And so we have all these systems that weren't built for the climate we have now, right? And the last example I'll give is like here in Vermont. I just did a story about this actually, about planning for flood resilience here in Vermont. Small state, 650,000 people. But one of the experts I talked to said, like, this is a $30 billion problem to get people out of harm's way because we built so many homes and businesses in floodplains. And we've been doing that for a long time here. And we're finally getting the memo, some of us, that, actually you are in harm's way, right? Like, Vermont is often cited as one of these climate havens. Mm-hmm. These recent floods have disabused a lot of people of that notion here, right? And we've got forecasts of heavy precipitation events increasing by 50% in the coming decades here. So it's, this problem's only going to ratchet in one direction. And I think in different parts of the country, people are waking up to that fact at different rates. But these changes are coming everywhere. And you mentioned insurance. I mean, to me, this coming crisis in insurability of homes in the United States, that is about to make climate change very real for almost everybody, because it's going to touch, if you have a homeowner's insurance premium, it's going to affect it. So like that's already playing out right now. And so in a sense, we don't need to time travel, to mid-century or the end of the century. Although if you do that, and again, if you talk to climate scientists, they will paint some pretty grim picture for you of what it's like to live in a world that is 3 degrees warmer. And that's what we're on track for right now. I don't know if it's really widely understood just how bad that is. Like you don't want to live in that world. That's a world in which we have hundreds of millions of people migrating because it's too hot where they live, or they don't have enough water where they live. So, the question is, how do we avert those grim scenarios by acting right now? And part of what's required to trigger that action is just people becoming alert to the ways this seemingly vast and diffuse problem is actually going to affect your life in very concrete ways.
Mm-hmm. To go back to the comment about the 3 degrees, I think what most people end up doing, and I think you know where I'm going to go with this, is you tell them the planet's going to be 3 degrees warmer. Is what they do is, well, it's 72 in summer at my house. So
yeah, right.
Yeah, so it's going to be 75. So what, right? Because they're not grasping what a 3 degree increase in temperature for the planet means. Even if it does mean for some of us that the impacts of climate change are going to be a little bit slower on us than it is in other places, if this does lead to like a cascading impact wherein people can't live and it triggers migration, and I think we're starting to see this, my fear is that the knee-jerk initial reaction is going to be ultra-nationalism across the planet. That's I guess, a secondary impact of climate change that leads to another dire outcome for the planet.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I feel like this is one of the great under-discussed risks in the climate world, climate discourse. And, you can argue that we've seen that play out over the last decade, right? Like climate change, by some analyses, played a role in driving up food prices in Syria and parts of the Middle East. And that, may have had something to do with the wave of discontent connected to the Arab Spring and then the Civil War, and then there's migration into the EU, and then now the EU is seeing this kind of backlash, right, driven by these immigration patterns that may have been somewhat driven by climate shifts. And you could say the same thing about immigration from Central America, where people in certain parts of that region have experienced food price pressures and climate driven scarcity, right? And so again, like we don't need to forecast too far into the future. You can see evidence of what you're describing playing out around the world in different ways. But this larger, to what extent we're seeing a rightward shift in a lot of countries, and a rise in kind of xenophobia, how implicated is climate change in that? I don't know. Future historians will tackle that one, but it's definitely political scientists I know are starting to kind of really dig into this question of, well, if you don't manage this transition in a careful way right now, what are the risks that the dominant governing response to these accelerating climate impacts, these shocks, is more, as you said, more nationalistic kind of platforms, right? Like keeping people out or blaming other people for your problems. It's a real concern, and I don't have any answers to that one, but I do think like that is a story that we're going to have to just keep an eye on, like this insurance story. As a journalist, I tend to I try to sort all this fire hose of information into, what are the stories here?
Mm-hmm.
And I really do think that one you just kind of spelled out is going to be a big one.
Mm-hmm.
And climate migration writ large. And, what I was alluding to earlier, this insurance issue is becoming a huge story now, especially, and I think the LA wildfires has elevated it somewhat, given more attention to this. There were maybe $30 billion in insured losses in LA from that one event. Mm-hmm. It's a staggering number. And you have insurance companies already pulling out of California and Florida and Louisiana and these vulnerable parts of the country where, maybe it's hurricane path country or wildfire country. And then, what does that do to driving, these climate migration patterns, right? We're going to see people who get priced out of certain places because they can't afford insurance. And if you don't get insurance, you can't get a mortgage. And that is going to contribute to some, not just flows of capital, but of human beings, moving mm-hmm. to other parts of the country. And where they're moving to, are they going to be ready for all those people? These are big questions. But just because, the current administration wants to erase the words climate change from all their policy guidance doesn't make these problems go away, right? I mean, just today, there was a report that came out from the First Street Foundation. It's a nonprofit group that looks at climate risk in the housing market. And they're warning that like by mid-century, the US could see $1.5 trillion in real estate value just wiped out because of climate risks getting priced into insurance markets, and then the migration that kind of results from people responding to these increasing risks, wildfire, flood, drought, storms. I mean, that is, as a journalist, like that's a huge story.
Mhm.
But it's something that could blow up on the current administration's watch, whether they think it's a real problem or not.
So, in the equation of action, so if we wanted to consider all of the things that might spur action to tackle climate change, I think one of the big components of that is the message, right? Like how is this being sold to people? And you have a message coming from people that deny climate change, and then on the other side you have climate scientists and people that believe that climate change is a real thing and needs to be addressed. And unfortunately, in a lot of places, including in the United States, that breaks on a right-left spectrum, right? So the right is more denial and the left is not. And I think that the right has a better message right now. And by that, I mean it's more effective message, whether it be that it's a hoax or that we'll somehow iterate and innovate and we'll just learn to live with it, or climate change policy is killing jobs for no reason, et cetera. That's
Yeah.
working better than the message that whatever the left is selling or climate scientists are selling, not that those two are interchangeable. You mentioned the story about insurance and how that's going to impact our lives. But I guess in your reporting or, in your own thinking, what do you think are some effective messages or ways to sell a story that might actually land with people that are adamantly opposed to the idea of climate change as being a real thing?
Yeah, boy. If I had the answer to that one, I would,
Yeah.
I would be in a different line of work. But you know, I wonder to what extent a different message, a different combination of words would unlock, you know, whatever magical force you're looking for, political will, bipartisan support for aggressive climate action. I mean, I'm just thinking during the campaign, Donald Trump at a rally said, "Hey, you notice they don't talk about the environment anymore. It's because the environment doesn't play, and he's a guy, whatever you think of him, he knows he's good at reading the political winds and testing out messages and
Mhm.
seeing what resonates with people. And he's right. He's right. And if you look at surveys of what were the salient issues during the election, climate ranked pretty low. And yet you look at other surveys and you see broad-based support, north of 70% among registered voters for the government doing more on climate change and clean energy. Like these are very popular with the broad public, even among Republican voters. If depending how you word it, there is support for some of these things. I think people who in the climate advocacy world, there's been so much hand wringing and debate over, what message, should we use? What's going to stick and move people? And I just don't know if there is some, skeleton key
Mhm.
message that is going to unlock that. I don't think there's a substitute for just like building the slow, boring work of building coalitions, and organizing and clawing back political power. And I guess what kind of frames are conducive to that. I mean, again, as a journalist, I can tell you what doesn't work, right? And if you put it, if the framing puts climate action or any policy that's focused on reducing emissions up against, say, affordability, it's going to lose, right? And I just saw that happen here in Vermont during the election here. We had a proposed policy called a clean heat standard, which is
Mhm.
basically just trying to, it's a big source of emissions here in Vermont is heating fuel, right? It's a cold place. People burn a lot of oil and propane to heat their homes in the winter. And we have climate targets that are enshrined in law that we have to meet. And so legislators put forward a proposal to, it's complicated. It's kind of a Rube Goldberg thing, but, and that was part of the problem. They couldn't communicate it simply how it would work and what it would do. And it was used as a battering ram by Republican candidates on Democrats. And a lot of Democrats lost their seats, I think, because of it, because of this. A lot of voters who are feeling really pressured right now because everything is getting less affordable.
Mhm.
Housing, childcare, healthcare, and this is true around the country, right? And so if, all I can say is any framing or messaging or policy design that doesn't reckon with that reality, that affordable, we're in a moment where affordability is top of mind. And of course, Republicans have been very effective at turning any new proposal into a culture war issue.
Mhm.
They're coming to take your hamburgers and gas stoves, and even if a lot of the stuff is just made up, that's very effective. And I don't think people who are pushing for climate action have a good countervailing kind of strategy to that yet, right? And
Mhm.
we're kind of living in the wreckage of 10, 15, 20 years of scattershot approaches to framing the climate problem as like, oh, it's green jobs, or no, it's going to be about, saving homeowners money if they transition to electric vehicles, although they're more costly up front. But hey, use this tax credit. And, it's like
Mhm.
it all gets so convoluted for the typical person who doesn't follow this for a living that unless you can both design and communicate your policy in really simple, accessible, digestible terms, you invite these attacks, right? So it's not a satisfying answer, but I mean, those are some of the dynamics that I see at play.
Well, I think another dimension to this is that in a lot of ways, outside of the objective, either immediate or eventual impact that climate change will have on all of us, the argument to invest in clean energy and climate saving initiatives and proposals and policies is really moral to a lot of people, more so than it is economic. It's becoming economic and it will become economic. But I wonder if part of the reason that it's being framed economically, like this will save you money, et cetera, is because
Mm-hmm.
it's a bigger punch than the moral argument, which is, this is about saving the planet and it might not be touching you right now, but it is definitely touching other people and it will touch you eventually. And I'm a little concerned that we might be entering a post-moral era, which could be a
Mm-hmm.
bit of a death knell for progress that we're making.
I think you're right that historically, the way this has been framed is as a moral imperative, right? And
Mhm.
that's clearly hasn't worked, right? I mean, look around. Uh, I won't say everyone is in retreat. I mean, there are plenty of actors, you know, around the world, but also cities and states that are not retreating from action on climate change. But we're in a moment where the zeitgeist is one of retrenchment. Like, you see major banks and even utilities, that I've covered basically abandoning their net zero pledges. And it's easy
Mhm.
to be cynical and say, well, they weren't worth much to begin with. But that rhetorical shift matters, right? Because money will start flowing behind it. And yeah, I think maybe that points to an opportunity. I think there are a lot of things missing from these dominant narratives that as a journalist and storyteller, I'm really interested in trying to kind of fill in some of those gaps. And the big narrative is, doing this is going to be so expensive, right?
Mhm.
And it'll be cheaper to just adapt, to the climate change that's coming than to totally remake our energy system and food systems and the way we make cement and steel and everything. And what often fails to make it into that conversation is the fact that I mean, I talk to a lot of energy experts and they paint a very different picture that somehow doesn't percolate up into the general consciousness. It's actually backwards to say that clean energy will be more expensive and that dealing with a hotter, chaotic climate will be manageable, not as expensive as decarbonizing. That's backwards. It's actually the reverse. Adapting to climate change is going to be way more expensive than we think, is kind of the consensus. And electrifying stuff that currently runs on fossil fuels and building out renewable energy is actually going to generate efficiencies and savings that are far greater than most people appreciate, right? you know, just to give you an example, I think something like 40% of global bulk shipping is just coal, oil, and gas, right?
Mhm.
So the less you depend on coal, oil, and gas to move cars around and make electricity, that's 40% of shipping that starts to evaporate. If you electrify home heating, vehicles, the more you do that, you unlock these huge efficiencies, right? You just don't need as much energy input to heat a house or to move, a vehicle around. And you start realizing these efficiencies that multiply. And suddenly, at least at the macro scale, you are you're generating these savings. And that's to say nothing of like the health benefits, which to me, as someone who's written a lot about this, the health impacts of air pollution are so enormous and they never enter the ledger on these policy
Mhm.
conversations, which is remarkable to me because, the less coal, oil, and gas you burn, fewer asthma attacks and hospitalizations and cardiovascular disease. I mean, that's setting even that enormous health and cost savings aside. I guess what I'm trying to say is like this narrative that's taken hold that like acting to prevent catastrophic climate change is going to be very expensive, but getting used to it will be cheaper. Flipping that script and making this an issue of, oh no, the more we dawdle and let this just accelerate, the costlier it will be to you, homeowner, you, local government, city government that can't finance a bond to upgrade your sewer drain system anymore, because you have whole neighborhoods that can't be insured. Like the sooner you get out ahead of that problem, the cheaper it's going to be. And so I think there might be an avenue for the right people who know how to be more succinct and bumper stickery than me to make the case that, ambitious action on this transition is actually about affordability at the micro and macro scales. I don't know.
Mm. And actually, it's interesting that you mentioned health insurance, because as long as we're talking about insurance, that's another form of insurance that's probably going to be directly impacted by this.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, yeah, I mean, there in so many ways, respiratory illness, Lyme disease, infectious diseases that we're not used to seeing that are spreading like dengue. Like these things are going to show up, right, in the healthcare cost side of the ledger as time goes on more and more, even in places where people aren't used to thinking that they're vulnerable to climate-driven vectors. And heat waves, is like, that's going to be a huge issue too. Parts of the country that don't have as much air conditioning or cooling centers for lower income people to retreat to during a heat wave. Like these are incredibly costly things to deal with, for a healthcare system, for a city. And we're just not used to thinking of them as costs you have to account for and budget for. And conversely, as we're not used to thinking of clean energy as like an investment that or a hedge against that or something that will unlock huge savings. And so maybe we'll see that kind of come to the fore more and more as the moral framing it is increasingly out of fashion given current political winds.
I do want to talk a little bit about heating. We've brought it up a couple of times because I live in a part of the country where for pretty much all of the winter, it's pretty common for most people to, at least in part, heat their house with firewood. In a fireplace. I am one of those people, and I'm ashamed to say that. And I'm especially ashamed to say that because I read your book, Fire and Ice, which talks about how bad soot is. It talks about black carbon. I think in the back, like in my lizard brain, every year I'm like, I don't think this is great, but I didn't really dig into it. And now I've really had to kind of reckon with this. So can you maybe tell me what black carbon is, what this is all about, and how we, myself included, might be contributing to it and how we could get off of it?
Yes. So I wrote a book called Fire and Ice. It is a nonfiction narrative about the health and climate impacts of black carbon, which is what scientists call soot, basically. And, when I got started reporting that book, look, I had no idea it was such a bad actor either, right? And it was very eye-opening to spend 4 or 5 years reporting that book. And on the far side of that journey, I'm pretty careful about avoiding air pollution and not having my kids, breathe too much of it either, because I now know far too much about how dangerous it is to breathe that soot. But at the same time, look, I mean, I have a wood stove in my house here in Vermont, and I love splitting wood and burning wood. I'm pretty careful to only burn dry fuel because of what I know. And what I know is that black carbon is one of the great overlooked health risks in the world. I mean, it's a major constituent of this fine particle pollution that kills, over 3 million people a year who are exposed to it from household air pollution, and even more, over 4 million from outdoor air pollution. And there are higher estimates out there too. And so I started working on that book thinking that this was an overlooked health story, and it still is. I mean, it's still a huge killer globally, more than tuberculosis, malaria, HIV/AIDS combined, people who die from breathing soot and other pollutants. But there's a climate piece to that story too, and it turns out that black carbon, if you picture, these tiny little black rocks basically suspended in the atmosphere, they're super efficient solar heat absorbers, right? And if you live near snow and ice in particular, you should worry a little bit about like the soot coming out of your diesel truck tailpipe or your wood stove chimney or your coal power plant. Because when that soot lands on snow and ice, it darkens it and it reduces the light reflected off it, and it heats it up and it accelerates the melt. And you see that playing out across the Himalaya. You see it in Greenland somewhat, and other icy parts of the world. And so I wrote that book thinking, wow, no one's talking about this. And I would get messages from readers, kind of like what you were saying, Sean, like, oh, all this time I've been burning wood thinking I was virtuous, and I'll never do it again. And I'd write back to him and say, no, I still burn wood too. That's okay. Just don't do it. If you're in a dense neighborhood where you have like kids with asthma downwind breathing your wood smoke, or if you live right next to a glacier, but it's a tricky problem, because the solution to it is burning less stuff, right? Like burning stuff, especially burning stuff in inefficient ways, makes soot, and we breathe a lot of that soot, and over time it can damage our health and even kill us. And I'm like everyone else. I smell wood smoke and I'm like, oh, that is a cozy, wholesome smell, comforting smell.
It's a connection to our ancestors.
Right. It is. Yeah, absolutely. That's true in every culture pretty much. But there's also part of my brain that's like, oh, danger, danger, because there's some real toxic stuff in there. So it's like it points you in the same direction, like get beyond combustion as much as you can. I have heat pumps in my house, right? But we still, every now and then, we like the wood stove because it's nice to sit in front of the fire. But it is a super efficient wood stove, I should add.
I don't think mine is. So one of the things I hear from a lot of people when, they're being asked to take measures in their lives to do their part is that there's a lot of cynicism looking at billionaires and looking at, government officials that are all contributing much more damage to the environment than, any individual is. And yet there is stuff that we all can be doing and should be doing in our daily lives. So what are some things that you would suggest that we could all be doing, including maybe burning less wood fires?
Yeah.
To maybe just do our part, as minimal as it might feel.
Yeah. It's interesting, over time, the answer to this question has kind of whipsawed back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
And for a while, there's this idea, oh, your individual carbon footprint, consume less and think about how much you drive. And it turned out that BP, the oil company, was, one of the originators of the the focusing on the individual consumer footprint as a way to deflect attention from these big fossil fuel companies' more kind of systemic role in keeping us dependent on fossil fuels. But then, and then there's a backlash to that as more people kind of get clued into that. It's like, no, the most important thing you can do is organize and elect people who take climate change seriously to office, right? Like that is where your power is if you care about climate change.
Mm-hmm.
But now, I mean, like, I think you need to recognize that if you care about this and you're worried about where things are heading, and I would suggest you should be worried, you can do both, right? Like, you don't have to default to your role as a consumer, which is kind of in the US how people often default, like, what should I buy more or less of? And that's important, right? Like, if you have the means and the resources, to buy an electric vehicle or put solar panels on your roof or get a heat pump, like good for you, go for it. But I would emphasize to people that there is so much opportunity at the local government scale. We're, in addition to defaulting to our roles as consumers, we default to like our roles as consumers of national news and politics, and we overlook what's going around and happening in our own communities. And go to your local zoning meeting, like where they're figuring out where to build dense housing out of a floodplain, or like your planning commission meeting. Go to town and county government hearings. Yeah, you'd be surprised. Like, you can make a lot of noise and have an outsized impact if you just show up and be kind of the person you're waiting for. And one opportunity that I remind people about, and this is born out of, my more recent book, I wrote about this fight against a gas pipeline in Appalachia that was being put forward by these two big energy utilities in Virginia and South Carolina. And I learned a lot about public utility commissions. Every state has one. And there are like 4 or 5 people on it. And these people wield immense power. They have billions of dollars at their command. They can tell these huge energy utilities what they can and cannot build and what they can charge you as someone who pays your monthly electricity bill. You can go show up to these meetings where these things get decided. And, the legal term is intervene. You can be an intervener and comment. And that is a lever that is overlooked, even though it's a lever in all 50 states, just waiting for people to grab. So those are just a few things that come to mind. There, you'd be surprised. You start looking around, there are more ways to get a handhold on this huge boulder rolling downhill towards your city or your village than you might think, right? Like, there are more things you could grab. Pick 1 or 2 if you care about this stuff. But I think all of that is downstream of just talking about it, right? It's like, I think there are a lot of people out there who are concerned about climate change and, the future their kids will inherit and the way things are trending these days. And they just assume that, I'm guilty of this too. Like, people don't want to talk about it, but like, yeah, just the more you talk about your concerns or hopes, or that starts to snowball.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen that happen in my reporting.
I do fear that in retrospect, the next few years will be revealed to us as, us just going down in a blaze of silver linings. But I do think one potential silver lining here is what you're talking about, and that is that we might be seeing an opportunity for much more local and state action on things, and potential for people, an opportunity for people to participate. So that is a good thing. But final question, you ready for it?
Yeah.
What's something interesting you've been reading, watching, listening to, or doing lately? And it doesn't have to be related to this topic, but it can be.
Okay. I've spent the last couple of months narrowing my focus to reporting a couple stories here in Vermont. One was about flooding, preparing for floods in the future. And the other was about forests. And I live out in the countryside, and I'm surrounded by forests. And it's been very fun, to get up from my laptop and stomp around in the snow with foresters and see how they see the world, like put on their lens, bird habitat and in this kind of tree. And here, over here was a tree that's 200 years old, a sugar maple. And, just being out in the woods and trying to think about some of the issues we've been talking about for the last hour, like, what is this going to look like 40, 50 years from now? I found that to be therapeutic these last couple months, taking the long view. And what else have I been doing? When I muster the willpower to look away from the news reports coming out of DC about various actors taking control of the Treasury Department or federal agencies, which is what's happening as we speak. When I do that and sit down with a huge book I'm trying to slowly make my way through is it's called The Dawn of Everything by the late David Graeber, anthropologist, and David Wengrow. And it's pretty fascinating tour through human history that is trying to remind you there are other ways to organize ourselves as human beings. People have tried lots of different ways of balancing, personal freedom and hierarchical, civilizational structures than we've been taught. And I'm in the early part of the book, but it's pretty interesting stuff. And again, I find it nice to kind of take the long view back in time too. It's helpful to do that sometimes.
One of the things that I've been thinking about for a little bit now, admittedly, I'm a progressive, so the direction that the country is going in right now is catastrophic to me. I'm also a pessimist, so those two things are married together. But one of the things that I've been thinking is some of the stuff that's really challenging for me is just these broadsides against the constitutional order and our system of norms. And to me, that just suggests that democracy is under attack. But then I was thinking, as a progressive, I haven't been particularly happy with the way American democracy has kind of played out in the last couple of decades. I mean, you could probably go back to the dawn of our democracy, to be completely honest. And so I'm wondering if it's just a good opportunity, or this is an opportunity for progressives to be thinking about, to go back to what you were just saying about how we structure ourselves. If we were to revisit the structure of our democracy, what would we do differently that would be hopefully better? As long as we're weakening the system, why not have our shot at it,
I've been thinking of this in terms of here in I keep talking about Vermont, but it's where I live. So, I'm going to talk about it one more time. It's town meeting season soon here. And we are very proud of our tradition of town meetings where we all get into a room and vote on different issues like, do we buy a new road grader? Do we hire another, part-time clerk at the town office? How much do we want to spend on our school? Every March across Vermont, these town meetings happen. And there's something lovely about it, right? You're shoulder to shoulder with your neighbor and seeing what they think about these issues. And then you take these voice votes, but you have this debate. Anyone can get up and say whatever they want. And there's a tension I've been thinking about lately. There's a lot of talk in climate energy policy circles about permitting reform, and we need to make it easier to build stuff in America. We don't build stuff anymore, whether it's high-speed rail, which we never really built, but transmission lines to get solar and wind power to where people use it, or even nuclear power plants, which we're going to need more of if you care about decarbonization. And so there's a tension there between this idea that, local communities have too much input in what gets permitted and what gets built and what decisions get made. And they can slow down anything, and they will, whether it's affordable housing in their neighborhood or a power line or a pipeline for that matter. And And yet, I think you go to any part of the country, and if you frame the question a certain way, like you'll hear a lot of people say, oh, local input's good. I should have input in what gets built in my backyard or my county or my state or my town. And that is a tension that we're going to keep butting into more and more, just in the context of this clean energy transition. We're going to have to build a lot of stuff really fast. And Trump's executive orders these last 2 weeks just made that a lot harder in some ways. He's paused permitting of wind turbines, and he's made it easier, by the way, to produce oil and gas on federal lands and build pipelines. But in terms of this question of like, can we reboot kind of the way we approach democratic governance in this country? I mean, I think a lot is going to hinge on how we navigate this question of how much local grassroots kind of input and control and engagement is there going to be, and involvement. And with climate change, like we talked about this earlier, there's just not a huge broad-based coalition for rapid climate action in this country. And there are a lot of smart people who thought for years about how to build a constituency for that. Maybe we'll start to see that overlap more and more with these fundamental questions of how do you rejuvenate democracy, given the attacks underway. I don't know. It'll be interesting. Again, as a journalist, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, silver linings.
It'll be a great story. But I don't want to end on that. I mean, I guess the last thing I'll say is that I think we're seeing more and more people, I think, slowly waking up to the fact, not only that climate change is going to touch their lives, it already is. It'll show up in your insurance premiums, your healthcare bill. It's gonna trickle and then flow into every corner of your life, sooner rather than later. Sorry, everyone. But this idea that democracy is a verb, right? Like democracy isn't you voting once a year. Like democracy is you going to your local town meetings, zoning planning meetings, public utility commission meeting, protest rallies, whatever. I mean, it is an active verb, and maybe we'll see kind of a zeitgeist shift in that direction in the months and years to come.
Jonathan, thanks for the conversation, and here's to a brighter and cleaner future.
Sean, here's to that, and thanks so much. This was fun.
The science is clear. There's no disputing it, logically anyway. Climate change is not just an environmental issue. It's a political, economic, and humanitarian crisis that demands urgent action. And it will touch all of us in profound ways in the very near future, if it hasn't already. As Jonathan Mingle said, the consequences of inaction are dire, and with political leaders like Trump poised to dismantle climate policy, the planet couldn't be in a more vulnerable position. So again, on yet another issue, we are at a crossroads. Either we act boldly now, or we face a future of worsening disasters, displacement, and economic and political instability. This is a serious moment that requires serious people to make serious choices, because the planet can't afford, we literally can't afford, another 4 years of climate denial. All right, check back next week for another episode of Deep Dive. Chat soon, folks.